name's Bruce Smith and welcome to another episode of In Nature's Realm Vlog. Now today I'm not fly fishing, but I am going to talk about fly fishing, and I'm going to talk about a very special person within fly fishing, and that person is the late David Scholes. Now a lot of you out there already know about David Scholes, but there'll be a lot out there that don't know about David Scholes, and that's what this episode's about, to familiarise people with David Scholes and his work. Now, David Scholes was a great fly fisherman. He was a great watercolour artist, and also he was a great writer of fly fishing. He wrote a number of books on fly fishing, and that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to highlight some of David Scholes' books and show you what I really enjoyed about it, and give you a bit of an idea of what is within his writings, what's some great sort of like chapters and so forth. So let's get into it. Let's talk about David Scholes, and we'll start off with his first book. So David's first book was The Fly Fisher in Tasmania. Now there's the first edition out there. Pretty rare to actually find that book, but they do come up, but it's quite expensive, The Fly Fisher in Tasmania. But the great thing is Jim Allen from The Complete Angler, he asked David Scholes whether he'd would like to do a second edition, and they did a second edition. So the second edition is available to everyone. Now, The Fly Fisher in Tasmania is obviously about fly fishing in Tasmania, but within the pages there's some great chapters, and probably my favourite chapter is the weather and the fishing season. In this chapter, David discusses weather patterns and so forth, and it's just fantastic. It's probably something that other authors have never really gotten into, but it's a great chapter and something that you should read. Probably the other chapter that I think is great is trout foods and fly patterns. Now he's got the trout foods. He discusses mayfly, caddisfly, sedges, crustaceans. He talks about midges, stoneflies, and other aquatic foods, terrestrial foods, and so forth. So, in my mind, they're two great chapters that are really highlighted. But all the other chapters are fantastic too. So if you can get yourself a copy, the second edition, they're available now. Fly Fisherman in Tasmania, his first book, fantastic, really good read. All right, so I could highly recommend that one. Right, the next book I want to discuss is the book, David's second book, is The Way of the Angler. Now, this is just full of great chapters, don't worry about that, but there's two chapters in particular that I really love, and the two chapters are, firstly, Mr. Finlay's Water Race. Now, Mr. Finlay's Water Race is a story that has to do with the Rubicon River. Now, I've fished the Rubicon River that many times, it's not funny, and the Goulburn area. This story is celebrated by a number of different people. It really is a classic. It's something that you definitely have to read about fly fishing on the Rubicon River. Now, there's another chapter here called The Red Spinner. Now, in this chapter, David discusses the red spinner that hatches on the rivers within Tasmania, and we also get those hatches here in Victoria and New South Wales and so forth. What's great about it is at the end he talks about a fly called the Macquarie Red. Now this fly, the Macquarie Red, was developed by the late Max Christensen, and what a pattern it is. Seriously, when I first tied it and then went out to fish the mayfly hatches or the spinner hatches, this fly worked a treat. Now I can seriously recommend the Macquarie Red. Not only that, it discusses how to tie the Macquarie red, and also talks about the Macquarie black, which a lot of people don't realise, because in Tasmania there's a lot of mayfly black spinners as well, and the Macquarie black is another great one. If you tie your own flies, that's a great pattern to tie as well. But you've got to read that chapter and then follow the instructions on how to tie the Macquarie red and the Macquarie black to the letter, and I tell you what, it's just fantastic. So that's a really great chapter. So yeah, The Way of the Angler, fantastic book. Now the next book I'd like to talk about is the book Trout Days. This is another classic in my opinion, and like all of David's books, all the chapters are fantastic, but there's one chapter I really want to highlight, and that chapter is In Retrospect. Now within this he talks about, you know, all of the writers of the days of the 18th century and so forth, some fantastic writers like Theodore Gordon, Francis and a few others. But what's fantastic in this is that he talks about a poem called The Angler's Legacy, and he mentions each section of the poem and then discusses what he feels that person was doing within that poem, or what that section was all about. And it's just fascinating, it really is, and it really, how can you say it, it brings your imagination really runs wild with it. It's just fantastic. You've got to really read it. It's great, a great chapter. And the other chapter that I find great is called The Red Car. I won't tell you about the red car because I don't want to spoil the actual ending in it, but just say that the red car is another chapter to read. It's just fantastic. So Trout Days, probably my favourite of all of David Scholes' book would be Trout Days, without a doubt. Now the next book I'd like to discuss is Trout Quest. Now Trout Quest is a great book for beginners. It has a lot of chapters on there with the basics of fly fishing, which is great, but it also delves into some great adventures that David experienced. And the great thing is he talks about the upper Yarra River here in Victoria, and because as you know, David Scholes fished Victoria quite extensively when he was young, and then he went over to Tasmania. So this discusses a lot about Victoria and grasshopper fishing, which is fantastic too. So a lot of tips there for beginners, and some great tips on grasshopper fishing and so forth. So yeah, highly recommend Trout Quest. Now the next book I'd like to talk about is the book entitled Trout of the Trout. Now the great aspect of this book is that it's the first book that David wrote that is fiction, and it's a tale of a trout egg that hatches out into a trout, and then it's the life of this trout going through right to the end. And again, I won't spoil it for you, but I can highly recommend this, and also the illustrations in this book are fantastic as well. So if you can get a copy of this, you're going to be very, very happy, and it is well worth the money. There's no two ways about that. Again, this would be pretty rare at the moment, and so it could be fairly expensive, but a great book. Trout of the Trout. book that is absolutely fantastic in my opinion is the book Fly Fishing Pictorial, and obviously it's a book full of pictures of David Scholes' fly fishing. And what's great about it is a lot of the photos are a mixture of fishing in Tasmania but also Victoria. And when you go through this book and you see some of the photos, there's a lot that I identify with, in regards with the Goulburn River, the Rubicon River, the Upper Yarra and so forth. And there's some just great photos here, and it goes through David's life. And also I forgot to mention this book is written also by Tony Ritchie. Okay, so I forgot to mention that. Tony Ritchie was the part author in this actual book. But the pictures in here are basically following the life of David, and when he was very young, and also right through his career within the Air Force and during the war. And it's just fantastic. And some of the photos are just incredible in regards to that time, going back to that time. There's one photo of a trout actually leaping out of the water, and it's just incredible, the photography that was taken with cameras that probably were not as advanced as our cameras today. So some great photos, and great photos of flies. It mentions different flies, gives stories towards those flies, and introduces a lot of David Scholes' fly fishing friends of the day. Matt Christensen, Fred Stewart, and a whole host of other people. It's definitely something you've got to buy, because some of the photos are just out of this world. They really are. Definitely recommend this book, A Fly Fishing Pictorial by David Scholes and Tony Ritchie. Now this book, which is entitled Macquarie River Reflections, is another fantastic book. Now, what I love about this book, it talks about the Macquarie River. Now, personally, through David's writings, I decided many years ago that I would start fishing the rivers over in Tasmania. And I probably completed, about 15 trips every year going over to Tasmania, and I'd always stop in and fish the Macquarie River. Now in this book, David discusses the Macquarie River really in great detail. It's a really fantastic read, and if you love fishing the Macquarie River, or if you don't know of the Macquarie River, read this and then get over there, because even though a lot of the David mentions that the mayfly hatches aren't as good, and a lot of other anglers have said that to me as well, that the hatches aren't as good as what they used to be. For me, it was 10 times better than the hatches in Victoria, and I had some superlative fly fishing days on this river. But this book again goes through his experiences on the Macquarie River that were taken from his fishing diary, and it's just fantastic. You've got to really read it. Highly recommend it, and would be available today at a reasonable price. So if you can get your hands on the Macquarie River Reflections, you'll be very satisfied after reading this book. Absolute fantastic book. Now this book, which is entitled The Enchanting Break of Day, is another great book by David Scholes, and it's great in the for me in the aspect that I fished the Break of Day River when I was over and fishing the rivers quite a lot, and it was through David Scholes' earlier books where he mentions the Break of Day in Trout Days is one time where he talks about there that really made me want to go over there and fish this river. And was I absolutely pleased when I got over there. It is an absolutely gem of a river, I can tell you. I'll never forget the time I went over there. There was an adjacent property to one of the main properties there called Malahide. Malahide, the property owner there, wouldn't allow people to cross his property. So I actually went to an adjacent property not far from there, asked for permission to get onto across their land to get onto the river, and they allowed me to do that. And little was I to know that I actually was fishing on Malahide, not realising that because I crossed the property lines. But that's another story. But what a great river. It really is incredible. Very similar to the in New South Wales in regards to the actual riverside vegetation and so forth. But trout in there was just fantastic. I couldn't believe it. And I talked to the property owner who told me that they felt there was something wrong with the river and they were getting it tested. I didn't know what was wrong with it. I was catching trout like you wouldn't believe, and good sized trout as well. So The Break of Day is another book that discusses David's journey on the Break of Day with some of his celebrated friends, and talks about flies and some great illustrations in here, which are just fantastic. Yeah, it's another book that I could highly recommend, and that is The Enchanting Break of Day, available to now. This book, The Air War Diary, isn't a book about fly fishing. It's a book about David Scholes' experiences as a Lancaster bomber pilot during World War II, serving in England. Now, David actually won the Distinguished Flying Cross with his services over in England, and it was quite amazing because my uncle George, he was a Lancaster pilot over in England during World War II, and he also won the Distinguished Flying Cross. And it makes me wonder whether David Scholes and my uncle George actually might have known each other. I did go over to Tasmania, and I talked to David on 2 occasions, one at his home and one time here in Melbourne when he was promoting his one of his books. But I never knew that my uncle actually won the Distinguished Flying Cross until after that. So I'd never actually found out whether David had met my uncle George. I would say it's a real chance, but yeah, I don't know. But this is a great book. It talks about how David went over to England, his experiences and the amount of missions he had to do, and he discusses each mission that he did do. And he also talks about when he had his days off, how he would go fly fishing to some of the streams and so forth around England. It's just absolutely fascinating to me, what David did, and it really shows another side of David Scholes, how brave David was, how courageous he was, and just incredible stuff. It's something that you've really got to read if you get a chance, and this is definitely available. So The Air War Diaries, written by David Scholes, fantastic book. Now, the last book that I'd like to talk about, and would probably be David's best book, is the book called Memory Hold the Rod. It's an absolute beauty. Very expensive. When I actually bought this, this was valued at around about $300, and with this book you actually got a set of prints that were from some of David Scholes' watercolours that he produced many years ago. The great aspect of this book is the way this book is being produced. It's just absolutely beautiful. It is introduced by, or each chapter is introduced by David Scholes' friends, and some of those friends are like Noel Jetson, Andrew Braithwaite, and a whole host of other people. And special thanks must go to Jim Allen for producing such a great book. Jim is a great fly fisherman himself, and would definitely be one of David Scholes' one of his greatest friends, I would say. And what a book this is. It's just fantastic, and it has in between each chapter a watercolour that David produced, which are just absolutely beautiful. I'll try and get one just here. Yeah, here we go. They're separated by onion paper, and this is then lifted up, and you see a beautiful watercolour that David did in his work as an artist. And it is beautifully produced, beautifully made, and has a chapter from David, each of David's books up until that time. Like here we've got The Way of the Angler, and the introduction is by Noel Jetson. Andrew Braithwaite does one, an introduction on trout days, and it goes on and on. Beautifully, beautiful book. You've definitely, if you can get your hands on it, I think they're still available. If they're not available, they might be a bit pricey, but absolutely I would recommend that you fork out that little bit of extra money there. So that is David Scholes', just a few of his books. There's a number of books that I haven't mentioned, and while I haven't mentioned, I just basically just haven't got the time, but they're great books as well. There's no two ways about that. So I'd just like to end off at my experiences with David Scholes. Now, I remember I was at the Fly Fishing Expo, and I was doing fly tying demonstrations, and I was actually tying a Macquarie red, and a gentleman walked up and started to watch me tying these flies, and his name was Andrew Braithwaite, and we started talking as you do at these shows, and I basically got on to David Scholes with the tying of the Macquarie red, and he said, "Oh, you like David Scholes' writings, do you?" And I said, "Yeah, I absolutely love what David writes." And he said, "Would you like to meet him?" And I said, "Well, yeah. I'm going over to Tassie to fish the rivers." And he said, "Well, I'll talk to David, and we can organise a day where you could get your book signed and so forth." So I took all the books I had at that time, and took them over with me to Tasmania, and that day arrived where I saw David, and it was just fantastic. What I experienced at that time was a family, because I met his wife as well, that are very old-fashioned values, and the wife took me into the sunroom, and there was David sitting there, and we had a talk about the rivers, and we talked about fishing in general, and he signed all of my books, which was just fantastic. And what a day it was! It was just an incredible experience in regards to how people with old-fashioned values lived, or still live. it was just a really magnificent day. And I also met David when he was actually promoting his Memory Hold the Rod book, and he signed that book while I was there, and while there was a lot of people there, I got to have a talk to him as well. And so my experiences with David Scholes were fantastic. And you know, with my Uncle George, what a conversation that would have been. I would have loved to have been able to talk about whether he met Uncle George. So it would have been really good, but David's passed away now, and I'll endeavour to always keep David Scholes' memory alive, because he was such a courageous person, a fantastic person, personality-wise, a great fly fisherman, a great artist, and he loved nature as well. And that's what I'm all about, nature, in nature's realm. I just love fly fishing, and I love where fly fishing takes me. I really do. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode of In Nature's Realm vlog. I'll endeavour to bring up different subjects like this, and I sure hope that I can have some great interviews as well lined up for you. So until next time, have a great fishing day, and I'll see you next episode. Bye for now.